The afternoon, he replaced my car's insurance policy without telling me, listing himself as the primary policyholder on a vehicle I had bought with my own money before we ever met. He told me it was simpler that way for the paperwork. My name is Josephine. His name was Desmond. And by the time this story ends, you will understand why I spent 17 months keeping a second identity folded inside a sewing kit he considered too tedious to ever look at twice. I want to start by saying that Desmond was, by every outward measure, a generous man. He paid for things without being asked. He remembered birthdays, anniversaries, small details other husbands forgot. It took me years to understand that generosity, in his hands, was not a gift freely given. It was a transaction he kept careful, silent track of, one that entitled him, in his own mind, to a corresponding degree of control over whatever he had touched, including, eventually, me. We had been married 9 years when the insurance policy changed hands. Together 12. In the early years, his generosity looked, from any reasonable distance, like devotion. He insisted on paying off my student loans within our first year of marriage, a genuine kindness I was grateful for at the time. It took much longer to notice that he began, from that point forward, treating every subsequent financial decision in our household as though it required his final approval, having established, in his own mind, that he had effectively purchased the right. The car had been mine before Desmond and I ever met, a graduation gift from my own parents, paid for entirely by them, registered and insured under my name alone for the first 3 years I owned it. When I discovered, by accident, while searching for a document in our shared filing cabinet, that the policy had been quietly restructured 8 months earlier to list Desmond as primary policyholder, with me listed only as a secondary driver, I asked him about it that evening, as calmly as I could manage. He told me it was simpler for billing purposes, since he handled our finances anyway, and that surely I didn't think it mattered who technically held the paperwork on a car we both used. I did not argue further that night. I nodded, the way I had learned to nod, and I went about the rest of my evening as though nothing significant had happened. But lying awake beside him later, I understood, with a clarity that startled me, exactly what had occurred. Desmond had not simplified paperwork. He had quietly claimed legal ownership, in the eyes of an insurance company, of the one possession in our marriage that had been entirely, unambiguously mine before I ever met him. And a man does not do that without first deciding, somewhere beneath his careful reasonableness, that everything I owned was ultimately his to manage. I made a decision that night that would occupy the next 17 months of my life. I decided I would rebuild, quietly and completely outside his awareness, a version of my own independence so thorough that by the time he understood what was happening, there would be nothing left of mine for him to quietly restructure in his own name. The sewing kit became my headquarters, an old wicker basket full of thread and buttons that Desmond, who found needlework tedious beyond words, had never once opened in 12 years of marriage. Beneath a false bottom, I built myself from a sheet of cardboard and craft glue. Following instructions I researched carefully during hours he assumed I spent on hobby forums, I began keeping a prepaid phone, a small folder of documents, and, over time, cash. The first thing I did was quietly begin reclaiming small amounts of money from the household budget I still nominally managed day to day, even though Desmond reviewed every major expense. Grocery costs reported slightly higher than actual, the difference banked in small bills inside the sewing kit. It was slow. Some weeks amounted to no more than $10 or $15. But I had learned, by then, that patience compounds in ways anger never does, and over 17 months, that patience became just over $7,000. Enough, I understood, to survive the first crucial months of a life entirely apart from him. The second thing I did was begin paying closer attention to what Desmond actually did with his own time and devices, using the prepaid phone purchased with cash from a shop 2 counties away, kept charged in short bursts, always returned to the sewing kit before he came home. Desmond worked as a senior loan officer at a regional bank called Castle & Trust, specializing in small business lending, helping local entrepreneurs secure the capital to open restaurants, repair shops, and family stores. He had worked there for 15 years and had built a reputation among the people who mattered to his career as a champion of the community, someone who genuinely believed in helping small business owners succeed. His supervisor, and the person he ultimately answered to, was a branch executive named Thaddeus Corwin, 60 years old, a man who had built Castellan Trust's local reputation over decades on the specific promise that the bank existed to lift up the community that had built it, never to exploit it. I had met Thaddeus several times at bank community events, a warm, plain-spoken man who once told me, with obvious pride, that Desmond was the most trusted loan officer we have, someone small business owners specifically ask for by name because they know he'll fight for them. I remember smiling and believing him completely because at the time I had no reason not to. That changed 11 months into my quiet preparation. On an evening, Desmond left his work laptop open on the dining table longer than usual, absorbed in a phone call in another room. A folder caught my attention only because of its curious name: Referral Partners, Confidential. Loan officers, I understood even with my limited knowledge, generally did not maintain personal folders labeled that way for a bank's own referral relationships. Inside were records showing that Desmond had, for years, been quietly steering small business loan applicants toward a specific insurance brokerage and equipment leasing company, both owned, I discovered through the attached correspondence, by a man named Ellery Fontaine, in exchange for undisclosed referral payments that violated Castellan Trust's own conflict of interest policies. Worse, several of the loan terms Desmond had structured for these referred clients included hidden fees and unfavorable rate structures specifically designed to maximize the referral payments flowing back to him at the direct expense of small business owners who trusted him to help them, not quietly profit off their desperation for capital. I did not touch the laptop further that evening. I closed the folder exactly as I had found it and returned to my seat before Desmond finished his call, and I sat there afterward for a long time, understanding, with a slow, sick clarity, that the man who had quietly claimed legal ownership of my own car had also spent years quietly profiting off small business owners who trusted him completely with the futures of their families' livelihoods. Over the following 10 weeks, I documented what I could, using the prepaid phone during narrow windows when Desmond left himself logged in, always careful, always brief. I sent nothing forward yet. I understood, even then, that what I had found involved real families who had trusted Desmond with their life savings and futures, and that acting too quickly could destroy evidence before it could ever help them. During this period, Desmond's oversight of our shared finances did not relax. If anything, it sharpened, an instinct I have since learned is common in men like him. He began, again, reviewing our joint accounts with unusual frequency, asking pointed questions about expenses that had never bothered him before. My own financial trail remained, deliberately, a boring record of nothing significant, while the prepaid phone and the growing folder of evidence stayed hidden inside the sewing kit, never once discovered. The night I understood the full scope of what Desmond had built, I was not looking at his laptop at all. I was sorting old boxes in our basement at his request, ahead of a planned renovation, files from years before Castellan Trust, back when Desmond had briefly worked at a smaller community bank that had quietly merged into a larger institution under circumstances he had always described vaguely as changing market conditions. Inside one box, beneath old performance reviews, was a folder of early correspondence with Ellery Fontaine, dated years before Desmond ever joined Castellan Trust at all. The arrangement, I understood with a slow, sinking clarity, was not new. Desmond had built this exact structure once before, at a bank that had perhaps struggled partly because of it, and had simply carried the same mechanism, refined and quieter, into an institution that trusted him completely with the community's future. I called my cousin Adelina that night from the prepaid phone, standing in the basement with the door pulled shut, Desmond asleep upstairs, unaware his wife was holding proof of years of quiet exploitation 20 feet below where he slept. Adelina, who had once nearly lost her own small bakery to predatory loan terms at a different bank years earlier, was silent for a long moment after I explained it, and then she said the words that finally pushed me from careful observation into deliberate motion. She said, "Josephine, this isn't just about you leaving him anymore. These are people's whole businesses, their whole family's futures. You have to do something." Adelina connected me, through her own bakery's accountant, to a banking compliance investigator named Corinne Ashby, who specialized in exactly this kind of loan officer misconduct. I called Corinne from a payphone outside a hardware store, paying with coins saved specifically for this purpose. She listened to my description of the referral payments and the hidden fee structures for nearly 40 minutes without interrupting, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried the careful weight of someone who understood immediately how serious it was. She told me two things I have carried with me since. The first was that what I was describing sounded like a sustained pattern of undisclosed conflict of interest and predatory lending practices, the kind of case that draws attention not only from a bank's internal compliance department, but potentially from state banking regulators and consumer protection agencies, given the number of small business owners affected. The second thing she said more quietly. She said, "Josephine, once this moves forward, it will not stop at your marriage. It could end his career and expose him to serious civil liability. I need you to understand that before we take another step." I told her I had understood that for months, and that understanding what those small business owners had lost was exactly why I could not simply walk away without acting. Over the following 10 weeks, working carefully through the prepaid phone and narrow windows of opportunity, I sent Corinne everything: the photographed referral records, the correspondence with Ellery Fontaine, the older files establishing the scheme's origin at Desmond's previous bank. Corinne compiled a preliminary investigative summary, methodical and precise, designed to withstand scrutiny from an institution that had every incentive to hope it was not true. While Corinne worked, I made two further preparations. The first was a consultation with a family attorney named Perpetua Namdi, recommended through Adelina's network, who specialized in cases involving quiet financial appropriation within marriages, a pattern she described with an accuracy that unsettled me the first time I heard my own experience summarized so precisely by a stranger. Perpetua began quietly preparing documentation to formally restore my sole ownership of my own vehicle and establish clear financial boundaries, built on years of records showing the car had always, legally, been mine alone before Desmond's quiet restructuring. The second preparation was smaller, more personal. I began, item by careful item, moving what remained of my own independent belongings, my grandmother's quilts, a small collection of my own paintings from art school that Desmond had always found too abstract for the living room, into a storage unit rented under a slight variation of my maiden name, funded entirely from the sewing kit's careful savings. I was not fleeing. I understood by then the distinction clearly. I was simply arriving, slowly, at a life that no longer required his signature to exist. The final piece arrived on an unremarkable Tuesday, when Desmond mentioned over dinner, with quiet pride, that Castellan Trust had just expanded his territory to include 2 additional counties of small business lending, meaning a significantly larger pool of entrepreneurs would now pass through referral relationships he personally controlled. He said it the way men like him say things they assume no one else at the table is equipped to fully understand the implications of. I refilled his water glass and said nothing, because I understood immediately what that expansion actually meant. More small business owners quietly steered toward unfavorable terms, more families' futures quietly compromised, while everyone around him continued to trust his careful, community-minded reputation completely. That same week, Corinne finished her preliminary report. Perpetua filed the ownership restoration and financial boundary documentation the following morning, submitting Corinne's findings simultaneously to the state banking regulator and to Castellan Trust's own internal compliance council, ensuring the information could not simply be quietly absorbed by anyone at the bank still loyal to Desmond. I made one final call myself, to Thaddeus Corwin's office directly, using my full name for the first time in over a year, requesting an urgent private meeting regarding what I described only as a serious matter involving lending practices. His assistant, a woman named Marguerite, asked for more detail. I said it was personal and it could not wait, and something in my voice must have carried real weight because she found me an opening the very next morning. I dressed with unusual care, a simple gray dress purchased with money from the sewing kit, hair pulled back, wearing a small brooch that had belonged to my grandmother, one of the few items I had kept back from storage. I did not attempt to disguise the particular tiredness in my own face, the exhaustion of a woman who had spent 17 months being quietly vigilant every single day, because I understood, by then, that this too was its own kind of evidence, even if no formal document would ever record it. Castellan Trust's main branch occupied a handsome, old-fashioned building downtown, all brass fixtures and framed photographs of ribbon cuttings at small businesses the bank had helped launch over decades, the visual language of an institution that had built its identity around genuine community trust. Thaddeus's office was lined with these same photographs, dozens of grateful small business owners shaking his hand over the years. He stood when I entered, shook my hand warmly, and gestured to a chair, his expression carrying the polite curiosity of a man with no idea his morning was about to end very differently than it began. I placed a sealed folder on his desk and slid it toward him without preamble. Inside was the summary Corinne and Perpetua had prepared together, the referral payment records alongside the hidden fee structures, the correspondence establishing the scheme's origin years before Desmond's employment at Castellan Trust, and a cover letter noting that copies had already been submitted to the state banking regulator that same morning. Thaddeus opened the folder slowly. He read the first page, then the second, and I watched his expression move through the sequence I had, by then, come to recognize in anyone confronted, all at once, with the discovery that someone they trusted completely had been quietly betraying the very community relationship they had built their institution's reputation upon. Confusion first, then a dawning, sickened comprehension, as he began to understand which specific small business owners, many of them, I would later learn, people he personally knew from decades in the community, had been quietly exploited by a man he had championed for 15 years. He looked up at me once, about halfway through, his hand pressed flat against the desk. I did not look away. I simply let him keep reading. When he finished, he closed the folder carefully, both hands flat against it, the stillness of a man absorbing a betrayal that struck at the very foundation of everything he had spent his career building. He asked, quietly, how long I had known. I told him the truth, that I had understood the full scope only in recent months, though the pattern itself, I suspected, predated even Desmond's employment at Castellan Trust. He thanked me, his voice unsteady in a way I had not expected from a man so composed at every community event I had attended with him, and told me the bank would cooperate fully with any investigation, whatever the cost to its own reputation. I stood, thanked him for his time, and told him the regulatory filing had already gone out that morning, timed deliberately so no one at the bank would have the opportunity to quietly manage the problem before outside investigators could examine it independently. Thaddeus nodded once, slowly, already reaching for his phone as I left the room. Outside the building, I stood on the sidewalk for several minutes before walking to my car, the very car this had all begun over, not to collect myself, because that work had been done slowly over 17 months and there was nothing left to gather in that moment, but because I wanted to remember precisely how it felt. The folder leaving my hands, the particular quality of silence in a room where a man who had spent decades building genuine community trust understood, all at once, how deeply it had been exploited from within his own ranks. Desmond called at 2 o'clock. I let it go to voicemail. He called twice more within the hour, each time closer together, the rhythm of a man beginning to sense, without yet understanding the specifics, that something fundamental had shifted beneath him without his permission. At 3:30, he sent a single text. It said only, "What did you do?" Not a question. He already knew, in the way guilty men always already know, even before they understand precisely what has caught up to them. I did not respond. I drove instead to the storage unit, sat for a while beside the boxes holding what remained of my life before Desmond, my grandmother's quilts carefully folded, my own paintings finally unwrapped and leaned against a wall where I could actually see them, and allowed myself, for the first time in 17 months, to simply breathe without calculating a single next move. Then I drove home, because Perpetua had advised maintaining an outward appearance of normalcy until the filings were formally processed, and because I wanted one final ordinary evening in that house as a woman who understood exactly what was coming, while Desmond still did not. He came home late that night, unusually subdued, and did not mention the folder or the calls or the text. He asked, instead, whether I wanted to order dinner, his voice carrying the careful, softened tone he used whenever some instinct told him his control over a situation was slipping and needed to be gently recaptured rather than forced. I told him I had already eaten. I went to bed early. He sat alone downstairs for a long time before he finally came up. The ownership restoration was formally granted 6 days later, returning full legal title of my own car to my own name alone. Castellan Trust placed Desmond on administrative leave within the week, once their own internal compliance review confirmed the pattern Corinne had already independently documented. He was terminated a month later, once the scale of the exploitation, ultimately traced across dozens of small business loans and estimated at several $100,000 in improper referral payments and inflated fees, became impossible for the bank to characterize as an isolated lapse in judgment. I did not attend the civil proceedings that eventually followed, filed on behalf of affected small business owners by a consumer protection firm once the regulatory findings became public, though Adelina did, several times, and reported back to me afterward in a voice that had shifted over the months, from personal outrage to something quieter and more settled, especially once she learned that several business owners would finally receive meaningful compensation for years of quietly inflated costs. Desmond settled the civil claims rather than risk trial, though the settlement obligations would follow him financially for years, and by then I had stopped measuring justice by any single outcome and started measuring it, instead, by the simple fact that small business owners across 2 counties would finally have a bank they could trust without reservation. Desmond's mother, a woman named Winifred who had never once, in 12 years, asked me a single question about my own life beyond how well I was managing her son's needs, called me once, weeks after he moved out. She asked whether I had known before it became public what he had actually been doing. I told her the truth, that I had known enough, eventually, to understand it needed to stop, and that I regretted it had taken this particular shape to get there. She was quiet for a long moment, and then, in a voice stripped of the polite distance she had always maintained with me, she said she was sorry, for years spent assuming that whatever seemed difficult about our marriage was mine to manage rather than her son's to answer for. We have not spoken since, but I think of that call sometimes, the strange, late arrival of an apology that changes nothing and still, somehow, matters. I moved eventually into a small apartment near Adelina's bakery, close enough to help her there some mornings for the first time in years, far enough from the house Desmond and I had shared that I stopped, within a few months, flinching every time I opened a piece of mail addressed jointly to us both. Adelina helped me unpack the last of my boxes on a bright afternoon in early summer, and when we finished, we sat on the floor of my new living room, the sewing kit open between us, the false bottom finally, genuinely empty, nothing left underneath it, but the ordinary spools of thread it had always claimed to hold. I think often about the woman I was the afternoon I discovered Desmond had quietly claimed my own car in his name, and about how long it took me to understand that his generosity had never once meant safety. I did not destroy Desmond. I want to be precise about that, the way precision has come to matter to me since. Desmond destroyed the trust of small business owners who had already risked everything to build something of their own and believed, reasonably, that a bank built on the language of community would actually serve that community rather than quietly profit from its desperation. I simply stopped shielding him from the consequences of what he had already done, one photograph, one document, one quiet phone call at a time, in a house he believed he understood completely, in a life he never once thought to look at closely enough to see what I was quietly building behind him, inside a sewing kit he was certain held nothing but thread. The most dangerous thing a man like Desmond can do is assume that a woman who has stopped questioning his generosity has also stopped keeping her own accounts. I had 17 months of accounting running beneath my silence, and by the time he understood that, the story had already been finished, filed, and delivered, in an office lined with photographs of grateful small business owners, by a woman he had once quietly decided did not need her own name on her own car.